The wisest man who ever lived. That's what they say about Solomon. Blessed by God with wisdom beyond all human understanding. So intelligent that kings and queens traveled thousands of miles just to hear him speak. His judgment was legendary. His knowledge was unmatched. His insight was divine. And yet, by the time he died, his kingdom was falling apart. The nation he inherited from his father David, unified and strong, split in two almost immediately after his death. The northern tribes rebelled. The southern tribes became a shadow of what they once were. Everything Solomon built, the alliances, the wealth, the power, unraveled within a generation. So here's a simple question. If Solomon was truly the wisest man who ever lived, why did he make decisions that destroyed everything? Why did he accumulate 700 wives and 300 concubines, creating a political nightmare of competing interests and loyalties? Why did he allow foreign gods to be worshipped in Israel, violating the core principle his kingdom was built on? Why did he tax his people so heavily and use forced labor so extensively that they rebelled the moment he was gone? These are not the actions of wisdom. These are the actions of excess, of poor judgment, of someone who had power but didn't know how to use it sustainably. But the paradox gets deeper. Solomon supposedly built the most magnificent temple the world had ever seen, a structure so grand, so perfect, that it became the center of Israelite worship for centuries. Yet today we can't find a single stone from it. Not one brick. Not one foundation block. The temple that was supposedly built with supernatural help from commanded demons and jinn has vanished so completely that archaeologists can't even confirm where it stood. Compare that to Egypt. The pyramids are still there, thousands of years old, still standing. The temples of Karnak and Luxor are still there. We can walk through them, touch the stones, read the inscriptions. Same with Mesopotamia. We've found the ziggurats, the palaces, the walls of Babylon. But Solomon's temple? Gone, completely, without a trace. And Solomon himself? No inscriptions, no monuments, no contemporary records from other kingdoms mentioning him. Nothing. For a king who supposedly controlled an empire, commanded supernatural beings, and accumulated wealth that made him richer than pharaohs, the archaeological record is silent. Now, does that mean Solomon never existed? Not necessarily. But it does mean the Solomon of legend, the sorcerer king with a demon army, the builder of impossible temples, the wisest man in history, that Solomon doesn't match the evidence. Or rather, the complete absence of evidence. After you finish listening to this audiobook, you'll understand how a possibly real king became a mythical figure, how stories grow over centuries, how each culture that touched Solomon's legend added their own supernatural elements until the man was buried under mythology. And you'll see why the most interesting question isn't whether Solomon existed. It's why someone supposedly so wise made such catastrophically stupid decisions. Let's start there. Chapter 1. The wisest man who ever lived made decisions so stupid his kingdom collapsed immediately after he died. Let's start with the most obvious problem in Solomon's story, the contradiction between his supposed wisdom and his actual decisions. The Bible claims God appeared to Solomon in a dream and offered him anything he wanted. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God was so pleased that he gave Solomon not just wisdom, but wisdom beyond any human who had ever lived or ever would live. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 12. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. That's the claim. The wisest human being in all of history, past, present, and future. And with that wisdom, Solomon made a series of decisions so catastrophically stupid that his kingdom fell apart the moment he died. Let's look at those decisions with basic common sense. First, 700 wives and 300 concubines. According to 1 Kings 11, that's what Solomon accumulated. Now, forget the supernatural claims for a moment. Forget the wisdom. Just think practically. What happens when a king has 700 wives from different nations, different cultures, different religious backgrounds, political chaos? That's what happens. Each wife comes from a political alliance. Each one represents a foreign power with its own interests. Each one wants influence, wants her sons to inherit power, wants her gods to be honored. That's a recipe for disaster. And the Bible itself admits this. 1 Kings 11 verses 4 says Solomon's wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. The wisest man who ever lived couldn't manage the obvious consequence of marrying 700 women with different religious beliefs. He didn't foresee that they might influence him, that they might want to worship their own gods, that this might create problems. Solomon, the wisest man ever, did it anyway. Second stupid decision: heavy taxation and forced labor. According to 1 Kings, Solomon built the temple. He built his own palace, which took 13 years compared to the temple's 7. He built fortifications. He built store cities. All of this required massive labor. And the Bible is clear about where that labor came from: forced conscription of Israelites. 1 Kings chapter 5 verses 13 and 14. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. And it wasn't just Lebanon. The building projects were constant. The taxation was heavy. The labor demands were relentless. Now, use common sense. What happens when you tax people heavily and force them to work on massive building projects that primarily benefit the elite? They resent you. They wait for the opportunity to rebel. And that's exactly what happened. The moment Solomon died, the northern tribes came to his son Rehoboam with a simple request. Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. That's from 1 Kings chapter 12 verses 4. A straightforward negotiation. Reduce the burden and we'll stay loyal. Rehoboam, following his father's playbook of terrible decisions, refused. He actually promised to make it worse, and the kingdom split immediately. 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. The unified kingdom of Israel, which David had built and Solomon inherited, was gone. If Solomon was truly wise, wouldn't he have seen this coming? Wouldn't he have understood that you can't indefinitely tax and conscript people without creating resentment? Wouldn't he have prepared his son for succession in a way that maintained unity? But he didn't. His son had no idea how to handle the crisis. The kingdom collapsed. That's not the legacy of the wisest man who ever lived. That's the legacy of a ruler who prioritized grand projects over sustainable governance. Third stupid decision: allowing foreign god worship in Jerusalem. This one is particularly baffling if you believe Solomon had divine wisdom. The entire foundation of Israel's identity was monotheism. Worship of Yahweh alone. No other gods. That was the covenant. That was the core principle. Solomon knew this. He built the temple specifically for Yahweh. He dedicated it. He prayed at its consecration. And then, according to 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 7 and 8, he built high places for foreign gods right outside Jerusalem. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Think about what this means. The man who built God's temple also built altars for gods that Israelite law explicitly forbade. Why? To please his wives, to maintain his political alliances, to avoid domestic conflict in his massive household. In other words, he chose political convenience over the fundamental principle his kingdom was built on. That's not wisdom. That's compromise. That's weakness. Solomon made short-term decisions that created long-term disasters. Marrying 700 wives brought temporary political alliances but permanent instability. Heavy taxation funded grand buildings but created popular resentment that destroyed the kingdom. Allowing foreign worship kept his wives happy but violated the covenant that held Israel together. These are not the decisions of someone with supernatural wisdom. These are the decisions of someone who had power and wealth but couldn't think beyond his own lifetime. A truly wise person would have built a kingdom that could last, that could survive succession, that could maintain unity across generations. Solomon did the opposite. He built a kingdom that required his personal presence to hold together, and the moment he was gone, it fell apart. Now, defenders of Solomon will say, but he was wise in his early years. He only became foolish later because his wives led him astray. But that doesn't solve the problem. It makes it worse. If Solomon was truly the wisest man who ever lived, His wisdom shouldn't have been conditional. It shouldn't have depended on not being influenced by women. Wisdom means seeing consequences, understanding human nature, making decisions that account for weakness, including your own. If Solomon couldn't foresee that 700 wives might influence him, he wasn't wise, he was naive. And the claim that he was wise but became foolish later just means his wisdom failed exactly when it mattered most, in his mature years when he had the most power and influence. Then that's not divine wisdom. Being smart when young and foolish when old. That's normal human decline. But we're told he had wisdom beyond all humans. Past, present, and future. So why did he fail so spectacularly at the basic task of governance, creating a stable, sustainable kingdom? The answer is simple. Either Solomon wasn't actually that wise, or the stories about his wisdom are exaggerated. Because the evidence, his actual decisions, and their actual consequences shows a pattern of short-sighted excess, political incompetence, and religious compromise. That's the record of a powerful king who made the same mistakes powerful kings throughout history have made. He accumulated too much, he spent too much, he compromised too much, and he didn't prepare for succession. And when he died, everything fell apart. You don't need supernatural wisdom to avoid that outcome. You need basic common sense and long-term thinking. But Solomon had neither, or at least his actions suggest he didn't. So the question becomes, why do the stories claim he was so wise when his actual decisions were so foolish? And that's where the mythology starts to reveal itself. Because wisdom in ancient texts isn't always about good decisions. Sometimes wisdom means the king said clever things, solved a few disputes, wrote some proverbs. The judgment of Solomon, where he threatened to cut a baby in half to identify the real mother, is clever. It's a good story. It shows insight into human nature. But one clever judgment doesn't make someone the wisest person who ever lived. And it definitely doesn't compensate for decades of catastrophically bad governance. Real wisdom is measured by outcomes, not by reputation. And the outcome of Solomon's reign was clear. A divided kingdom, a resentful population, a son unprepared to lead, a legacy that crumbled almost immediately. The wisest man who ever lived made decisions so stupid his kingdom couldn't survive him. That contradiction alone should make anyone question whether the stories about Solomon's wisdom are accurate, or whether they're stories, legends, exaggerations designed to make a flawed king seem better than he actually was. Chapter 2. No archaeological evidence exists for Solomon, unlike every other major ancient ruler. Here is a fact that should bother anyone who thinks critically about ancient history. For a king supposedly as powerful, wealthy, and influential as Solomon, there is zero contemporary archaeological evidence that he existed. Not one inscription, not one monument, not one record from neighboring kingdoms mentioning him, not one artifact that can be definitively traced to his reign. Now put that in context. The absence of evidence for Solomon becomes striking when you compare it to other rulers from the same time period. The Egyptian pharaohs left behind massive amounts of evidence. Pyramids that still stand thousands of years later. Temples with inscriptions detailing their reigns. Tombs filled with artifacts. Royal cartouches carved into stone. We know who ruled Egypt, when they ruled, what they built, and how they died. The archaeological record is extensive, detailed, and verifiable. Ramesses II, who ruled around the same general period Solomon supposedly did, left evidence everywhere: statue fragments, monumental building projects, military campaigns recorded in hieroglyphics, even his mummy, which can still be examined today. That is what a powerful ancient king looks like in the archaeological record: physical proof, abundant proof. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamia. The kings of Babylon and Assyria left behind palaces, inscriptions, clay tablets, and administrative records. Nebuchadnezzar II, who came after Solomon, left extensive evidence including the Ishtar Gate, the walls of Babylon, cuneiform tablets documenting his reign, and records of his campaigns. We do not rely solely on religious texts to know he existed. We have physical structures, government documents, and references from other kingdoms. That is normal for powerful ancient rulers. They leave large, unmistakable traces. But Solomon does not. There are no palace ruins that can be definitively attributed to him. No administrative tablets from his court. no inscriptions celebrating his building projects, no Egyptian or Mesopotamian records mentioning diplomatic exchanges or trade agreements with him. According to the biblical account, Solomon ruled for 40 years, built the most magnificent temple in the ancient world, accumulated extraordinary wealth, established major trade routes, hosted foreign dignitaries such as the Queen of Sheba, and controlled territory stretching from Egypt to the Euphrates. A reign like that should leave evidence: quarry sites, supply routes, administrative archives, inscriptions, something measurable. Yet there is nothing that can be conclusively tied to him. The temple he supposedly built took 7 years to complete, using cedar from Lebanon, vast quantities of gold, and tens of thousands of laborers. A project on that scale should leave architectural remains, foundation stones, or at minimum material traces of construction. Even his palace, which reportedly took 13 years to build and was even more elaborate than the temple, has no clearly identifiable remains. He is said to have possessed 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. That requires stables, infrastructure, storage systems, and military organization. Archaeologists have identified ancient stables in other regions from similar periods, but nothing can be firmly connected to Solomon in Jerusalem. The usual explanation is that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, then replaced by the Second Temple, which was later destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. Therefore, any remains would be buried beneath layers of later construction. However, archaeologists routinely excavate layered cities. They identify foundations from earlier phases, even when later structures were built on top. Massive ancient buildings leave foundations. Platform stones survive. Substructures remain. Even when upper sections are destroyed, the base architecture typically endures. If Solomon's temple matched the grandeur described, there should be identifiable remnants. Even if the superstructure disappeared, the foundational work should still exist in some form. At best, some archaeologists suggest certain structures might date to the correct period. But these claims are disputed and far from definitive. And even if a modest temple existed, that does not confirm the extraordinary scale described in the biblical narrative. A small regional shrine would be historically plausible. A gold-covered architectural wonder built at immense scale would require equally substantial evidence. That level of evidence does not exist. The broader problem extends beyond architecture. If Solomon ruled a prosperous and influential kingdom engaged in extensive trade and diplomacy, other kingdoms should have mentioned him. Egypt kept records. Assyria documented campaigns. Phoenician traders recorded commercial relationships. Diplomatic contacts were often inscribed or archived. Yet no known Egyptian inscription mentions Solomon. No Assyrian tablet references him. No Phoenician trade record confirms his alleged wealth or alliances. For a ruler who reportedly received 666 talents of gold annually, making him one of the wealthiest monarchs of the ancient world, the silence from surrounding civilizations is striking. The only detailed sources describing Solomon are biblical texts written centuries after his supposed lifetime. 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles reached their final forms hundreds of years after the events they narrate. That places them in the category of later historical tradition rather than contemporary documentation. Over centuries, stories tend to grow. Achievements expand. Characters become larger than life. A minor ruler can transform into a legendary monarch. For comparison, there is at least limited external evidence connected to the Davidic line. The Tel Dan stele discovered in 1993 contains a reference to the House of David. It is not extensive, but it suggests a Davidic dynasty was recognized. For Solomon, there is no comparable inscription. This leaves several possibilities. Solomon existed as described, but somehow left no archaeological trace despite activities that should have produced extensive evidence. Solomon existed, but was far less powerful than the biblical account suggests, with his story greatly expanded over time. Or Solomon is largely literary, a constructed figure representing an idealized golden age. The first option requires assuming Solomon is an exception to normal archaeological patterns. Powerful rulers leave evidence. Large building projects leave foundations. International trade leaves documentation. To claim that Solomon uniquely defies this pattern requires special explanation. The second and third options align more closely with how history and memory typically function. A smaller historical figure could have been magnified in later retellings, or a largely symbolic figure could have been shaped into a narrative centerpiece for national identity. When evaluating historical claims, the simplest explanation consistent with known patterns usually carries the most weight. Massive political power produces measurable traces. Extraordinary wealth leaves material remains. Diplomatic networks generate records. Solomon is said to have possessed all of these. Yet the evidence that should exist does not. That absence is not a trivial detail. It raises serious questions about the historical reliability of the account. Faith may not require archaeological confirmation, but historical claims do. If Solomon existed exactly as described, we would expect evidence proportional to his power and influence. The silence of the archaeological record suggests either that he was far less than the legend portrays, or that the legend itself grew beyond historical reality. The absence may not tell the entire story, but it tells us something significant. Chapter 3. The seal of Solomon and demon army were added centuries later by people who never met him. Here's something most people don't know about Solomon. The magical elements of his story, the ring that controls demons, the power over jinn, the ability to command spirits, are not in the original biblical account. They were added later. Centuries later, by people who never met him. Let's be clear about what the Bible actually says. In 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, Solomon is described as wise. He builds a temple, he accumulates wealth, he makes political alliances, he writes proverbs. But nowhere in the original biblical text does it say Solomon had a magic ring. Nowhere does it say he commanded demons. Nowhere does it say jinn built his temple. Those are later additions, and we can trace exactly when and how they were added. The earliest biblical texts about Solomon are purely about human wisdom, human wealth, and human governance. The Bible says his wisdom is a gift from God, but it's wisdom, insight, judgment, understanding, not magic, not sorcery, not supernatural power over spirits. So where did the magic come from? It appears first in a text called the Testament of Solomon. This is a pseudepigraphal work, meaning it's attributed to Solomon but wasn't actually written by him. Scholars date the Testament of Solomon to somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. That's 900 to 1000, 100 years after Solomon supposedly lived. 900 years, minimum. The Testament of Solomon is where you first get the detailed stories about the ring, about Solomon commanding demons to build the temple, about him interrogating spirits to learn their names and powers. It's also where you get the hierarchy of demons, each with specific afflictions and abilities. Orneus, who drains life force, Beelzebub, who claims dominion over the underworld, Asmodeus, who disrupts marriages. All of this is absent from the biblical account. Now, the same thing happened in Islamic tradition, but with different details. In the Quran, Solomon, called Sulaiman, is a prophet who has power over the wind and commands jinn. This is already a step beyond the biblical account. Supernatural power is now explicit. But the Quran was written in the 7th century CE. That's 1,600 years after Solomon supposedly lived. 16 centuries. The Islamic tradition adds specific details about jinn building the temple, about Solomon's staff and his death, about the Queen of Sheba's conversion. These stories don't appear in the Bible. They're Islamic additions to the legend. And that's fine. Every religion interprets figures differently. But it proves these are not historical accounts. These are theological interpretations written many centuries later. By the Middle Ages in Europe, Solomon had become a full-fledged magical figure in grimoires and occult texts. The Key of Solomon, Clavicula Salomonis, a medieval grimoire, supposedly contains Solomon's instructions for summoning spirits, creating talismans, and performing ritual magic. The Lesser Key of Solomon, Lemegeton, lists 72 demons, all supposedly controlled by Solomon, with detailed descriptions of how to summon and command them. These texts were written in the medieval period, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years after Solomon's supposed lifetime, and they attribute to him knowledge and powers that have nothing to do with the biblical account. They're not based on historical sources. They're based on the legend of Solomon as it had grown over centuries. Medieval magicians wanted their practices to have ancient authority, so they attributed them to Solomon. But it doesn't. It's medieval invention using Solomon's name for credibility. Now, why would these magical elements be added so long after the original texts? Because that's how legends work. They grow. A wise king in the original story becomes a wizard in later retellings. A temple built by human workers becomes a temple built by supernatural beings in the mythology. This isn't unique to Solomon. This happens with historical figures across cultures. King Arthur starts as a possibly real Romano-British war leader. Over centuries, he becomes a magical king with a sword from a lady in a lake, advised by a wizard, questing for a holy grail. The historical figure, if he existed, gets buried under layers of mythology. Genghis Khan was a real historical conqueror. But in later Mongolian legends, he becomes the son of a wolf and a doe, blessed by the sky god, with supernatural abilities. The historical figure grows into a mythical one. Alexander the Great was a real Macedonian king. But in later medieval romances, he's descended from gods, performs magical feats, travels to the edge of the world. Historical figures become legendary. That's normal human behavior. We make heroes bigger than they were. We add supernatural elements. We turn history into mythology. And that's exactly what happened with Solomon. The biblical Solomon is already somewhat legendary. The wisest man who ever lived, fabulous wealth, massive building projects. That's already an elevated portrayal. But it's still within the realm of human achievement. Wisdom, wealth, political power. These are things real kings could have, even if the scale is exaggerated. But then, centuries later, writers start adding new elements. A magic ring, control over demons, supernatural construction projects. Why? Because the later writers lived in cultures where magic and demons were part of the worldview. They read the old stories about Solomon and thought, if he was that wise, that powerful, he must have known secrets. He must have controlled supernatural forces. So they wrote new stories incorporating those beliefs. And over time, those stories became part of the Solomon legend. But they're not historical. They're mythological additions by people who lived 900 to 1,600 years after Solomon supposedly did. Think about it this way. Imagine if people in the year 3000 CE wrote new stories about George Washington, stories claiming he had a magical wig that gave him the power to control lightning, stories about how he defeated the British using spirit soldiers he summoned. Would those stories be historical? Of course not. They'd be later additions. Fantasy written long after Washington's time by people who never met him. That's exactly what happened with Solomon. Later writers added magical elements, and now many people think those elements were always part of the story, but they weren't. The Testament of Solomon is from 900 plus years later. The Islamic editions are from 1,600 years later. The medieval grimoires are from 1,500 to 2,000 years later. None of these are contemporary accounts. None of them are from people who knew Solomon or even lived in the same millennium. Now, does this mean Solomon never existed? No. It means the magical elements of his story are clearly later additions. Does this mean the biblical account is entirely accurate? Also no. The biblical account itself is already elevated and possibly exaggerated, but it helps us separate layers. The biblical layer is early, still written centuries after the fact, but earlier than the magical editions. The magical layer is much later, medieval and late antique editions that turned a legendary wise king into a sorcerer. If you're interested in what Solomon actually was, if he existed, you have to strip away the later editions and look at the earlier sources. And when you do that, you're left with a possibly real king whose story was exaggerated over time. Just a man whose legend grew so large that people kept adding to it, century after century, until the historical figure, if he existed at all, was completely buried under myth. Chapter 4. 666 talents of gold per year would make him richer than pharaohs. None of it has ever been found. 1 Kings chapter 10 verses 14 claims something astonishing. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents. That's not a casual number. It's meant to impress. But let's break it down. A talent was an ancient unit of weight, roughly 75 pounds, which is also 34 kilograms. Multiply that by 666, and you get about 50,000 pounds, or 22,500 kilograms of gold every single year. At today's market price of roughly $60,000 per kilogram, that's about $1,350 million per year. Over Solomon's 40-year reign, it totals around $54 billion. And that's just the annual tribute, not counting gifts, trade revenue, or taxes. This level of wealth would make Solomon richer than almost any pharaoh, and comparable to the wealthiest empires in history. So where is it? Where are the treasuries, the trade records, the artifacts, the infrastructure to support this gold? None of it exists. Let's examine what this claim implies. 1. Sources of gold. The Bible mentions Ophir as a source. Ships supposedly brought back hundreds of talents per voyage, but the location of Ophir is unknown. Proposed locations range from Arabia to Africa to India. Despite centuries of exploration, no archaeological evidence confirms its existence. No port facilities, no shipping records, no trade documentation. Real trade networks leave traces. Ophir leaves none. 2. Storage. Hundreds of tons of gold require secure treasuries. Civilizations like Egypt and Persia built massive, well-protected storage complexes, remains of which survive today. Solomon's supposed wealth would demand similar or larger facilities, but no treasury buildings from his period have been found. 3. Administration. Gold at that scale needs record-keeping. Officials, inventory logs, tablets, or papyrus records tracking incoming and outgoing wealth. Mesopotamian and Egyptian kingdoms left such documents. Solomon's treasury? Nothing survives. No tablets, no accounts, no bureaucracy. 4. Spending. Gold doesn't stay inert. It is used for jewelry, temple decorations, gifts, and trade items. These leave archaeological traces. For Solomon, there are none. No artifacts, no identifiable temple treasures, no objects linked to his supposed wealth. Defenders argue that the Babylonians looted the gold in 586 BCE, but looting doesn't erase foundations or treasury buildings. Even at looted sites, fragments survive. And Babylonian records, which detail other conquests, do not report receiving massive gold tribute from Jerusalem. Then there's the number itself, 666. Highly symbolic in biblical numerology, appearing later in Revelation as the number of the beast. Numbers in ancient texts with symbolic meaning are often literary, not literal. Solomon's gold is stated with exact precision, exactly 666 talents per year, which is unrealistic for trade-dependent wealth. Tribute fluctuates in reality. This consistency suggests literary construction, not accounting. Compare Solomon to rulers we have evidence for. Ramesses II of Egypt, one of the richest pharaohs, controlled gold mines in Nubia, built massive monuments, and left both artifacts and records. The Persian Empire managed wealth across dozens of kingdoms, with treasuries documented at Persepolis. Both have clear archaeological evidence. Solomon, ruling a smaller kingdom with no known gold mines, supposedly surpassed them in wealth, but left no evidence. The logical conclusion is straightforward. Wealth at the scale described for Solomon would leave undeniable traces, sources, storage, administration, artifacts, foreign records. None exist. Does that mean Solomon had no wealth? Not necessarily. A king of his era likely amassed some gold and tribute, but the claim of 666 talents per year for 40 years is wildly exaggerated, a legendary inflation. Over generations, a smaller, plausible amount was inflated into an impossible figure. The symbolic 666 hints at literary embellishment rather than historical record. The bottom line: if Solomon truly received this much gold, there should be massive, tangible evidence, but there isn't. The wealth described in the Bible is a story, not a historical reality. Solomon's riches belong to legend, not archaeology. Recognizing this is crucial to separating the man from the myth. He was not the richest king in history. He was a story whose wealth grew far beyond reality. Chapter 5. The Queen of Sheba story has so many contradictory versions. It's clearly legend, not history. The Queen of Sheba, is one of the most famous figures connected to Solomon. She traveled to Jerusalem to test his wisdom. She brought gifts. She was impressed by what she saw. It is a powerful story. The problem is that every culture that tells it tells a completely different version. The contradictions are not small details. They involve who she was, why she came, what happened between them, and what the outcome meant for history. When multiple traditions tell the same story but disagree on the basic facts, that is not how reliable history works. That is how legend evolves. Different cultures reshape the story to fit their own purposes. Let's look at the major versions and why they cannot all be historically true at the same time. The biblical version in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. The biblical account is simple. The Queen of Sheba hears about Solomon's wisdom and travels to test him with difficult questions. She arrives with a large caravan carrying gold, spices, and precious stones. Solomon answers her questions. She is impressed by his wisdom, the organization of his court, and the splendor of his kingdom. She gives him 120 talents of gold, along with spices and precious stones. He gives her gifts in return. Then she returns home. Now the Islamic version in the Quran and later tradition. In the Quran and later Islamic tradition, the story changes dramatically. The queen is given a name, Bilqis. The Bible never names her. In this version, Solomon sends her a letter calling her to submit to Allah. She hesitates but ultimately travels to meet him. Supernatural elements appear. Solomon commands a jinn to bring her throne instantly from her kingdom to Jerusalem. When she arrives and sees her throne already there, she is astonished. There is also the story of the glass floor that looks like water. When she lifts her dress to step across it, it reveals her humanity, disproving suspicions that she was a supernatural being. Most importantly, she converts. She accepts monotheism and submits to Allah. This is no longer just a diplomatic visit. It becomes a religious narrative emphasizing prophetic authority and conversion. The Ethiopian version in the Kebra Nagast. The Ethiopian tradition tells yet another story. In the Kebra Nagast, compiled in the 14th century CE, the queen is called Makeda and is described as ruling Ethiopia. In this version, her visit results in a sexual relationship with Solomon. He arranges circumstances that lead to her breaking an agreement, after which he claims the right to sleep with her. She becomes pregnant and returns to Ethiopia, giving birth to a son named Menelik. Menelik later travels to Jerusalem to meet Solomon. When he returns to Ethiopia, he supposedly takes the Ark of the Covenant with him. This version establishes the Ethiopian royal line as descended from Solomon and explains why Ethiopia claims possession of the Ark. But this story contradicts both the biblical and Islamic accounts. In the biblical version, there is no romance and no child. In the Islamic version, there is conversion, but no child. In the Ethiopian version, there is a child and a dynastic legacy, but no conversion narrative like in the Quran. They are entirely different narratives built around the same characters. Arabian and Yemeni traditions. Arabian and Yemeni traditions place the Queen of Sheba in Marib in Yemen, within the ancient Sabaean kingdom. Archaeology confirms that the Sabaean kingdom existed. However, no Sabaean inscription mentions a queen who visited Jerusalem. No contemporary records describe such a journey. The connection to Solomon is assumed based on later religious texts, not on archaeological confirmation. There is also disagreement about geography. The biblical phrase describing her as coming from the ends of the earth appears in Matthew chapter 12 verses 42. Yemen is far from Jerusalem, but Ethiopia is farther. Even the location of her kingdom is debated. If this were a straightforward historical event, we would expect consistent core facts across traditions. Names might vary, minor details might differ, but the basic structure would remain stable. Instead, we find different names, different home kingdoms, different motivations for the visit, different outcomes, different supernatural elements. Each culture reshaped the story to serve its own needs. These purposes are theological and political. They are not neutral historical reporting. Also, you must understand that none of this proves that no queen ever traveled to Jerusalem. It is possible that some diplomatic contact occurred between Israel and southern kingdoms. But the stories we have are not consistent historical records. They are layered traditions shaped over centuries. Each version reflects the beliefs and priorities of the culture telling it. The Queen of Sheba became a symbol, a witness to wisdom, a convert to monotheism, a mother of kings, a bridge between civilizations. That flexibility is the hallmark of legend. Real historical events are constrained by what actually happened. Legends are adaptable, they evolve, they serve different meanings for different communities. The Queen of Sheba story survives in multiple traditions because it is powerful and meaningful, but its contradictions, lack of contemporary evidence, and cultural reshaping reveal what it truly is. In conclusion, the man described as the wisest who ever lived made decisions so catastrophically stupid that his kingdom collapsed immediately after his death. A king said to be wealthier than pharaohs left no confirmed palace, no treasury structures, no vast gold reserves, and no clear archaeological trace of the immense prosperity attributed to him. A temple described as monumental and magnificent vanished without leaving identifiable remains. The numbers, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and 666 talents of gold per year, sounds more like symbolic exaggeration. The supernatural elements, magic rings, demon armies, control over jinn, appear centuries after his supposed lifetime, added by later cultures with different theological and political motivations. This does not necessarily mean denying that the historical individual may have existed. A ruler named Solomon may have governed a small polity, but the legendary king, the sorcerer with limitless wealth and cosmic authority, is a product of centuries of narrative expansion. The sources describing him are distant from the events, shaped by theology, ideology, and cultural memory. The legendary Solomon is powerful. He is influential. He is culturally significant. But significance is not proof. Influence is not evidence. Power of story is not confirmation of fact. The real lesson is not about an ancient king's supernatural wisdom. It is about the value of critical thinking, about distinguishing between tradition and verification, between narrative and material record. That practical wisdom is worth more than symbolic riches, because it rests on evidence rather than embellishment, and that difference matters.